Considering the role jazz and jazz musicians have played in social justice movements, why have we been so ass backwards with this one in regard to women? Is that all right for me to say ass backwards? Okay. And, you know, I'm open, or we're open, I believe all of us are open to hear anybody that doesn't think it's been that way. Well, first I want to read this quote that I like, an Audre Lorde quote. There is no thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. But maybe you can speak to us a little bit about intersectional feminism and how does the theoretical framework of intersectionality advance this conversation, if at all, and also provide us with some historical context to what we're witnessing today, the movement that we're witnessing today.
You know, first of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to be here with these amazing musicians and, you know, jazz scholars. And we should all thank Terri Lyne Carrington for organizing this panel and for organizing the tribute concert to Jerry Allen that's happening in the same venue later on. Thank you, Terri. Well, of course, nothing ever happens in a vacuum. And I think it's really important to recognize that in many ways, all over the world, this is the era of women rising up. Remember this time last year, approximately this time, there was the amazing Women's March. Millions of women all over the world who rose up against the Trump administration. And the message was, when women rise up, the whole world rises up with us. And I think that it's kind of bizarre that in the jazz community that has been so responsible over the decades for major contributions to social justice, you know, for doing civil rights work before the civil rights movement was born. It's kind of amazing that that the jazz community isn't leading the rest of us with respect to issues of patriarchy. You know, this really puzzles me. You know, why is jazz so, and she said, ass backward, you know, with respect to this issue. But I think that it's important now, and particularly since we're paying tribute to Jerry Allen, who was in the vanguard of this work, who foresaw, who presaged this moment, I think, with the work that she did, you know, especially in establishing the all-female jazz residency in New Jersey. One point is that if one looks at the history of jazz, one looks at the history of blues music, one sees a feminist impulse that was there before the feminist movement actually emerged. When one considers that it was not until the 1960s that there came to be any public recognition at all of issues like domestic violence, sexual assault. These were topics that were being explored in the blues. You know, look at Ma Rainey, look at Bessie Smith, you know, Billie Holiday, in the very interesting way in which she raised issues that later came to be recognized as pivotal feminist issues. So that's the one point that I want to make. The other point I want to make is that movements, wherever they are located, always create the backdrop for individual action. So sometimes we ask, well, why haven't there been more protests? Just as black people will ask, I remember in the 50s thinking, why is it that we're putting up with segregation? Why don't we rise up? But the point is that the individuals feel empowered to speak out only in the context of a movement. And our very individuality is created by collective movements. And I think that's where we are now. And this is one of the reasons why we're seeing the Me Too phenomenon. We're seeing, all of the women who now feel empowered to stand up and speak out. But I do think, as Terri was indicating, that we have to think in intersectional terms. Because if we only think about women, then there's a tendency to assume that the category women is abstract. And when it's abstract, that means it's white. Because we always defer to that kind of clandestinely racialized abstraction. And so when we think about women, we not only have to think about women of color, Black feminism, of course, has been very important in this respect, immigrant women, transgender women. We have to broaden our category and recognize that this is the moment of the ascendance of women. And certainly within the jazz community, we're beginning to see what will, I think, turn out to be an amazing movement emerge.
Everything you just said is inspiring. It's processing through my system still. But two thoughts arose as you were speaking. When you said a movement functions like a backdrop that empowers individual action, it also made me think of the power of individual action to contribute to the emergence of a movement. And I think that's something that feels so dangerous, particularly those of us, any of us who feel like we're in a position where we are earning the right to access resources from an institution that has the power, that is the gate through which we must pass to feed our children or pay for our parents' health care or even just be able to make a record. And it made me think again of these women that you mentioned coming out of the blues, Dinah Washington, Billie Holiday, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and I think these are women who had no protections at that time. And I think a lot of the early days of the avant-garde expansion in jazz, and I often think, well, when you already have nothing to lose because you have nothing, and you are already the prime victim of a disenfranchising culture, in a way you have more freedom to be the first one to stand up and say, I'm tired of this shit, and say no, and this happened to me, and it's not right, and the fruit is strange. And maybe for us as, striving pioneers in the music, it's good to remember we have access to so much more than our predecessors. And often I think that inspires us to be quiet because we have a fear of losing what we have the chance to grasp if we play along. And just as a reminder that it's, as much as the backdrop is necessary, we can co-create that backdrop by being willing to risk.
So some of that made me think of you, Lara, with your piece. And for those of you that don't know, Lara wrote a provocative article, Blues and the Objectifying Truth, and it sparked some interesting conversation. Maybe you can elaborate some more on, especially you're not feeling there's been quite enough significant progress for women in jazz, and anything else you want to elaborate on about your article.
Well, I think the motivation for writing that was twofold. And one, if you've read at the beginning, talks about how I was watching this movement gain momentum with the women in the media and the women in Hollywood and all these women in other spheres of labor stepping forward, right, and outing their oppressors. And I was sitting home in front of the TV going, when's it gonna happen? When's it gonna happen? I know it's there, I know it can happen, when's it gonna happen? And then thinking to myself, maybe it's not gonna happen. And maybe that's okay. And seeing two pieces of writing in particular that came out. And one of them was a piece in the New York Times by Gio Russinella, and the other was a piece by a saxophonist named Lauren Sevian. And the narratives in both these pieces seem to indicate that, gee, things are getting better. Aren't things getting better for women in jazz? And I was like, well, let's stop and think about this for a minute. So, you know, I have an academic background, and I'm more a journalist in practice than I am an academic at this point, right? But if someone wants to say something like that in a big way, and that has a big impact, I think, on how we frame our thinking and how we frame the conversations, then bring me some proof. You know, don't make a supposition like that and put it out there without any evidence, because we're reporters. It's our job to report things. It's not our job to just pass off opinions as fact. And so both those narratives I found really troubling, because both of them seemed to say we're on the right path, or I faced all this oppression, but it didn't hold me down. I managed to succeed. And yes, that's great, and hats off to the players who've been successful and to those who have spoken up. But not everyone can do that. And I think most of us have found ourselves in positions where we're making daily choices about what kind of injustice we speak up against and what we just have to let ride. So that's not just people who are performers, but for me as a writer also, like, because I've felt it, you know, like and I'll say also, I was on a panel on Saturday through the Jazz Journalists Association for their media summit on Saturday. And they it was a jazz and gender panel, but it was female writers. It's the first time I've actually ever been on a panel with 4 female jazz writers. I was kind of knocked out. And I was afraid that when I went to this panel, we were going to be speaking to the choir, and yet the audience was most of the male colleagues I've had now for over a decade, and I found that really, really encouraging. But just the only thing I wanted to get back to in the point was that we really, when people aren't speaking up, we need to listen to the quality of that silence and evaluate it to really think, what is that silence saying to us? Because it could mean many things. It can mean everything's cool, or it could mean things are really not cool, right? So just because there's silence, I just wanted to make sure someone stepped into that gap and said, don't interpret this as meaning that everything's okay. We really need to think about it more.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you further, though, about the data that you just briefly mentioned it, but could you give your thoughts more on data collection? We spoke a little bit about that.
Do you have a minute to indulge me?
Yeah.
Just a quick minute?
That's why we're here.
So, so many critics do a year-end list, right? If best of 2017. So I decided instead I wanted to do a year-beginning list for 2018, and I posted it on my Facebook page, and it's a public post, and anyone can see it. And so I'm not an activist. I'm like I said, I'm more in a role as a reporter. But I decided that there were a bunch of stories that I'd really like to report in 2018, and that maybe some people could make them happen for me. So I made a list of them. There are 7 of them. So my list of things that you could help me report this year would be, and this one's going to happen, I think, the first one. A blog post that examines the percentage of male versus female artists as represented by year-end critics lists for new releases, which arguably have the power to replicate and reinscribe gender biases. A straightforward tally using, say, the 2017 NPR Music Jazz poll, for which there were 137 respondents and 5 of them were female, just FYI. It would provide a measure, if imperfect, of female artist representation among critically successful recording projects. That exercise in itself couldn't help but raise the question, why are the numbers of women on these lists so low? 2, a news story on the establishment of support services for women musicians by perhaps the Jazz Foundation, AFM Local 802, or Music Cares through NARIS, whether specifically for women in jazz or those who work in all styles and genres. These support services include counseling for those who have experienced harassment, like the new Help Musicians UK mental health support line, which is real in the UK, and pro bono legal services for those who'd like to know what recourse they might have if they've been subject to discrimination. 3, a news story on a series of workshops sweeping the jazz community that teaches us how to be effective allies. These workshops could take place in university music departments across the country, through the Jazz Education Network, or maybe at the next Jazz Congress. A news story on postcard parties from which thousands of messages are sent to university presidents, alerting them that their jazz faculties currently include an acceptable number of women musicians, which can sometimes still be 0 musicians. 5, a news story about a symposium that brings together women working in new music circles and women in jazz. Composers Missy Mazzoli, Sarah Kirkland-Snyder, Du Yun, Paola Prestini, outspoken advocates for women in their artistic circles, will share information about new organizations and opportunities that are reshaping the landscape of new music and helping female talents flourish. 6, a think piece that explores non-binary gender identities in jazz, and through interviews with musicians asks how we can better support those who are gender fluid. And 7, last but not least, a think piece on the end of the panel discussion as jazz's preferred method of publicly exploring critical issues, and the beginnings of a movement that instead favor workshops, sit-ins, letter-writing campaigns, hackathons, protests, and other types of events that activate the community and offer practical solutions. It's just a short list.
But it was worth taking the time to hear all those things. Very well thought out. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see, Vijay, I see you taking notes. I'm wondering if you have something you want to share based on what you've heard, or I can also move to, she mentioned education, and I know that that's, from what we've talked about, part of your campaign to help get more women in jazz education.
Well, I'm here to listen, and I am here to take notes, because I remember when one of the tweets went out announcing this discussion, some woke bro came at me.
I definitely saw that.
And was like, what's Vijay Iyer doing on this panel? Couldn't they find any women musicians? I'm like, yeah, they could, and did. But why shouldn't men be a part of this conversation? And I can say now, I can also say now that I can tell just by the average pitch of your responses that it's mostly women in this room. And so we need to ask ourselves, why didn't more men show up this afternoon to a panel on gender? I mean, they've got gender too, right? So that's, I mean, I guess where I find myself is, as a man who moves around in the world as a man, but also as a man of color, that I am both the beneficiary of privilege and also of a whole constant mist of microaggressions, like all of us, So I understand intersectionality from that standpoint of like finding myself on a spectrum, of empowerment and its opposite, I guess we could say. For example, I happen to be the #1 album of the year on said NPR Critics Poll.
That's right.
And I actually publicly tweeted, like, well, thanks, but there are only 5 women critics on that list. So I feel like, well, here's my chance, as someone who's benefited from this system, to also respond to it and try to do little things about it. And so, a lot of people, people have varying relationships to that glorious F word, feminism. And, we can aspire to be feminists. Certainly men can have feminist thoughts and feelings, but what are you doing about it, So I find myself in positions where, for example, I direct the Banff workshop in jazz and creative music every summer. So that's a position where I can make a difference at the level of people who are just beginning or just entering a career in this strange system that we're all in that's called jazz, that I keep my arm's length from that word, but we're all sort of here under it. So that's a space where I feel, well, okay, what if we think about admissions to a program like this in a way that is more holistic? So it isn't just about who are the top of the pile in every respect, but also thinking about the contemporary term that people use as precarity or precariousness, which is like, for whom might this be one of the only opportunities that they might ever receive, you know? And then we can think, well, that's a person who might otherwise not have any such chance. And that can be for a lot of reasons, because of where they come from, because of financial background, because of the set of opportunities that they have, for example, as a woman in the world, you know. Because I can say that, sure, by the time a lot of people apply to this program, they're maybe in college already, or in their 20s, maybe they're in a conservatory program, or maybe they're already out there doing stuff. And I find, for example, that I'll admit a whole bunch of people, and then certain people can't accept the invitation. And I've been doing this program for 5 years, so I've been able to keep tabs on it. And what tends to happen is the people who have to say no, thanks for inviting me, but I can't come, for whatever reason, I had to take this gig, or something's going on with my family, something or other. It's almost always women, and it's almost always disadvantaged minorities who have to say no. So then I have to go again down that list and say, well, I'm sorry you can't come. What if we offer you some money? Like, what if we pay for, what if maybe there's more scholarship money available? Maybe we can. I try to be proactive about these things, but I've seen time and again that year after year, it's women who have to say no first, and it's black and brown people who have to say no first. So the system, even when you try not to, the system keeps benefiting white men because they're already taking advantage of a larger environment in which they're privileged. So that's the kind of environment that we all find ourselves in, including all of you. So it's sort of, it's like Professor Davis has said, she quoted for her most recent, one of her recent books, the line from the song that says, "Freedom is a constant struggle." And so that's the kind of care and awareness that I try to bring to every situation I find myself in. I mean, it's still true that last week I played at Birdland with my sextet, which is all men, so I'm also part of the problem, you know. But in my small ways, here and there, I try to do something about it, where it counts and where I can make a difference in somebody's life. And I'm not perfect, and I'm sure there's another woke bro out here who can come at me. I have no doubt about that. But I hope I can at least serve as an example to other men who find themselves in a similar position of relative privilege or relative power and can maybe do something about it from where you're at.
Well, I would like to, encourage you to, because I know when we spoke, I was happy to just hear you say that, because when we spoke, you said the same thing. You said, you're part of the problem in that way, as far as employing women, at Harvard, or accepting them to band. Well, I mean,
I don't sign any checks at Harvard, by the way.
Well, bringing artists in residence, or I know I've done 2 things there, with you. So thank you. But I guess my question is, when will that translate to you collaborating with more women, not just necessarily in your band, but you had said you don't, collaborate as much with women just in your own projects. So for me, it feels to me that those are the kinds of things that need to happen. I'm not just singling you out, but, with, 95% of male artists to be, more inclined to those types of collaborations.
Oh yeah, no, it's been a priority of mine, and I do have quite a few women collaborators, Ok-Young Lee, Imani Uzuri, Linda O, I've worked with quite a few times. And also I can say that, for example, as faculty at Banff, we bring in, I make a point of making sure that we, there are women role models present too. And that's not just women role models for other women, but women role models for everybody. So that, because a lot of people who've been through these systems of jazz education have never been taught by a woman anything, I remember last year we had Professor Tia Fuller on our faculty, and there was a saxophonist there who a lot of us know. She's a fantastic young saxophone player. And I have to say that the week that Tia was on faculty, this young woman's tone maybe doubled in size. I said, what happened? She said, the way that Tia put her hand on my belly to show me where to breathe, I'd never trusted anyone to do that before. So that's the kind of intervention that can happen at the level of the body, that we maybe take for granted or don't think about. And another thing that is I remember when Billy Hart joined us on faculty, and we asked him to talk about women who had mentored him. And I don't know if people know that one of his first major gigs was with Shirley Horn. She taught him a whole bunch of stuff when he was a teenager about how to play, like how to swing, like how to make the hits, and how to accompany. And when he talked about her, he brought, we played some recordings, and he just basically started, we all started crying because it was such a poignant and authentic moment of human relation, that we tend to kind of leave out of this equation. The other thing that happened last summer, I'll just say, in terms of having a critical mass of women in the room, whether it's as students or as faculty or as collaborators, is that the whole dynamic changes. So last summer, we had 40% women students in the program, which was unprecedented for us. What is that? Yeah, I mean, it's not my fault alone, but what that means is that not only does it mean more women are being given an opportunity, but there's like a complete shift in the energy in the space, because suddenly it's acknowledged that this isn't just a marginal problem. And Tia led this revolutionary discussion that day that also involved Ok-Young Lee and Jen Xu and Imani Uzuri and myself and Tishman Sori and Rich Brown and Matt Stevens. And the way we got men to show up, by the way, is that we advertise it as something else. This is where I invented the term gentle ambush. Sometimes you need to kind of attack folks with something they didn't know they needed. Anyway, so a transformation happened that day because there were enough women present in the room that certain things could be said that had never been said before in a space like that about how many people are carrying trauma and how much healing we all have to do and how we can support each other through that process. And maybe we'll talk some more about that.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up question on that. And I actually had the pleasure of teaching one of those Banff students this fall at the New School, and he spoke about it in exactly the same terms, and that it was very liberating for him as a male student, as a saxophonist, to be able to work with women as fellow students and as mentors. But I just wanted to ask, I mean, you're in a special situation in that it's a summer program and you have so much creative control over faculty and over students. Is there a way we can look to this model and bring it more into an academic context or a conservatory context? Because there structurally, things seem to be more challenging in the way that faculties are set up in many conservatory situations or in academic music departments where hiring is, it's much more complex. And I think maybe you and Angela might have some perspective on that, or Terri Lyne at Berkeley.
I mean, I don't teach at a conservatory, so I can't say. I will say that in the case of Banff, I mean, people will apply, will reapply, and it's just a 3-week program, so it's you know, if I have to put someone on the wait list this year so that I can let in more women of color, I'm going to do it because that person can reapply and it's not going to ruin their lives, you know. But when it's at the level of like letting someone into college, that's a bit more drastic. So I don't know, it's a different set of dynamics. But I will also say that the first question that people ask as soon as you bring up a topic like affirmative action is a question about quality. As if these things are opposites, and they aren't. I'm just going to say that they aren't. They aren't opposites. It's not like we're, you know, digging down into the bottom of the barrel to find women who can, you know, it's not like that. It isn't. It's just about maybe thinking a little bit differently about what admissions actually means.
Yeah, also, just before we leave this topic, I want to just acknowledge that there has been obviously stuff online, social media, conversations about sexual harassment as well at Banff, and I'm just, I guess, wondering if you could share briefly the steps that have been taken to ensure that that kind of thing is not happening anymore. What's been going on to change the climate there?
I don't speak for any of these institutions, so let me just say that, okay? I don't speak for Harvard, and I don't speak for Banff, and I'm not saying that. What it means is that I am engaged in ongoing critical relationships with all of them, you know? But, or transactions is maybe a better way to put it, because these are, you know, these are institutions that are larger and older than any of us, and I do what I can in my little trajectory through them or around them. I do know that the Banff Center in general has always had policies in place. It's more about whether people are educated about them, and they're also, I do know that they are adopting new policies in the coming weeks going forward that will affect staff, faculty, and students in all the programs to address these very questions. Most universities have some set of codes in place. Most of those codes are constructed to cover the ass of the institution. So we can still say ass on this panel, right? So I'm aware that a lot of it is about avoiding lawsuits, you know? So what I find is that when we're interacting with these systems or these institutions, we might need to have do some extra work to say like, okay, yeah, there's some sort of safety net in place or some sort of set of procedures in place, but beyond that, can we care about each other in a way that maybe isn't the underlying premise of this institution? Can we construct a sense of community among ourselves that, and this is something we could all ask ourselves as members of this thing that keeps getting called the jazz community. What that means is like, maybe we should care about each other, right? So maybe that's the way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm also artistic director of a summer program at Berkeley, so with all the things that are going on there, I know this, summer especially, it's a topic that will come up. But as artistic director, you want to personally, obviously make sure that the students feel safe and know, their recourse and all of that. Speaking of sexual harassment, I know Arnetta and I have had some conversations about that. And I wanted to, hear from you how you deal with that in some of the settings that you're in.
I know starting off young, given I did come from a high school that did have a lot of female instrumentalists. So at the time, it wasn't odd to be in a room with other female trumpet players until I got to college. That's when everything it was like culture shock musically as well, because I went from having female friends that played instruments to literally having to search all 4 years of college just to find somebody to practice with. And it was a struggle. And ultimately, it never happened, unfortunately. So I was fortunate enough to be able to go to teachers such as Terri, such as Tia. Since I didn't have female peers to work with, I had female mentors that were right at the school, and they were accessible, easy to talk to. Terri brought up students feeling safe. I know with the recent articles that have come out, reading some of the names, I was like, wow, that would have been good to know when I first got to Berkeley, given that I was in a room with one of the people. So I was like, man, that's kind of concerning that we didn't know until, like, 6 years later? It's kind of not fair, but at least now we know. So that's a good thing. And I guess another thing I would speak on, I guess, is a form of outlets, given, like I brought up Terri and Tia Fuller, which are very, very important. So when it comes to different camps and schools, having women on the faculty, it helps a lot, maybe for that one female instrumentalist that might be at the school that nobody's looking at, but the two female instructors that could be there could definitely be pivotal in that one person's life, such as myself. So,
Specifically, when we spoke, you told me how you adapted, your.
So adapting to it. So at school, since I was surrounded by a lot of guys, I knew their approach would be, oh, here comes this chick. I wonder what she does. She probably sings. And then I just look at them and smile. And there were a lot of times where they passed me a mic, and I just looked like, y'all don't really want me to sing anything. So after like the 50th time that happened, I just got tired of it. And in order to gain respect, I almost had to put up like a front of just being hardcore. And at first it starts off cool because you see, okay, people are starting to respect me. They know, kind of intimidating, which can be good at times, but it can counter really fast when that front becomes your personality. So I know it's something I've been trying to, I wouldn't say fight, but just to be able to control so that it just doesn't become my overall self. Because I'm in a band now where it's majority females, and I walk in a room, everybody gives each other a hug, everybody says hi, I just feel normal. I really do. I feel it's like a sense of freedom that I just never had before, because I've never been in that situation until like last November. Yeah, that's like very recent. So yeah, it's like this hardcore front. It's like, okay, if I walk in, maybe if I, overdress myself, kind of defeminize myself, maybe I'll be able to relate to the guys more, and they'll respect me. And that's just, it's unfortunate, and that's just how it is to this current day in the jazz world, R&B world, pop world, all over. So.
Do you see a difference, Arnetta, between your experiences in the R&B world and the jazz world?
The one difference that's pretty blatant, I would say, in the jazz world is being young, 23 years old. I'm dealing with people my age, and then somebody that could be like 85. So, I mean,
Or they seem like they're 85.
Yeah, so it's like the age gap and the amount of generations in the room. That's one thing that's different. Whereas though in the R&B world, you might have a pretty common age range. The main difference is it's like this very thin line in the R&B pop world where, with females, it's like we have to be dressed up, high heels, makeup, just beat face, just have this whole get up. It's just all visual. They don't even care what you sound like. It's like, does this person look good? But at the same time, it's like, if you don't look, you could be a great musician, but if you don't look the part, you just won't get the gig. So it's like you gotta find a way to kind of do both at the same time. So, and in the jazz world necessarily, it's there, but it's not as drastic. Like, if somebody could play, it's like, yo, homegirl could play. There's no doubt about that. Let her play, put her on the bandstand. And then from there, she could take charge and just blow everybody away. Whereas on the pop world, I know me personally, I like to wear sneakers all year round, but I also respect what the job calls for. So I know if I'm going to take a gig with an artist like Beyonce, it's like, duh, you got to wear heels and makeup. So it's like I prepare myself for situations like that. Instead of, you know, just walking in the room as the girl that likes Jordans, you know. So it's, you just got to kind of find a way to maneuver. But pretty much just to start on it. Pretty much it.
Thank you, Arnetta, for sharing all of that and being so candid and honest. Okay, so Esperanza, I just wanted to ask you too how you feel sexism has impacted your career as specifically as a bassist. I know we've had many conversations, but I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you've dealt with that, or if you, you know, think about it. And then we obviously have spent a lot of time in a female trio with Jerry Allen and yourself and myself, and how that felt to you different.
I really, really identified with something that you just said, Arnetta, of learning without ever being taught how to emasculate yourself. I use the word virility because the two terms are too anchored in our, you know, organs, reproductive organs. But I also, it personally bothered me. You know, maybe it doesn't bother everybody who walks into that room and has to say over and over again, like, no, I'm not somebody's girlfriend or a singer, like, I'm here to play. It personally bothered me to the point where I, too, was willing to change my behavior. And it calcifies something in you when you start to war with yourself. And yeah, it can be really exhausting that you be out for 2 weeks, and every time you leave your room, you have to put on a persona to be seen as yourself. It's so crazy. And actually, personally, that turned into a sort of resentment towards the music, and actually towards my instrument in a way, because then I felt like now I can't be mediocre or have a bad day or like want to take a few months off and like show up at a session and not be as killing as I was last time. And that's not fair either. So it's like you surrender some sort of right to be yourself at your own pace in this space, because you won't be, quote unquote, given permission to evolve at your own speed. And it's funny that we're talking about this right now, because just a few weeks ago, Terri and I were having a conversation, and I said, you know, Terri, I don't feel like playing this instrument anymore, because I feel tired. Not about the music. It's not about practicing. It's like these years of this weird struggle where it's like I can't not play anymore, because if I don't show up and be like, killing it, then somehow I'll be seen as less than, and other people like me will be seen as less than. And I mean, your testimony just now feels so familiar, Arnetta, even to the point of, to your question, Terri, for the first time being in a group with all women, it's something that you grow so accustomed to an energetic dynamic, you don't notice you're in the dynamic anymore. You don't notice that you're bracing. You don't notice that you're sending the verbal, behavioral, and so many other roles message, I am not accessible to you in any way except for the music. You can't touch me. You can't kiss me. I don't like you. Don't get near me energetically because it's not that game. And that's something that I think male musicians may not encounter as often. And believe it or not, that takes a lot of energy to maintain all the time. So in the trio context, at first it was weird. I didn't know what was going on. But what happened was, I think for the first time, we all were able to put all of our guard down for the first time and just do, keyword do, just do what we came to do. That's all we had to do once we were on the stage. Because there's even something about eye contact. You'll be in the middle of playing and a man on the bandstand makes eye contact with you, and your practice of being the only woman trains you like you have to give eye contact back in a way that's not inviting. Right. Or like tempt other words that are more energetic understanding of what you do and don't do to make it clear that I'm here as a player. And then with Terri and Jerry, we just, I felt like with our guards down and with the energy all directed into what we were there to do, I personally know I accessed aspects of my musicianship that I never got to because I was always in a battle. And you know you're not free if you're in defense mode, you're in survival mode. And the music needs more than survival energy. You know, yes, it's about struggle and blah, 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 but there's something after surviving which I had never really experienced until I was with you and with Jerry. And just as a note on that, that didn't happen by accident. Terri fought to make that space possible, and I'm eternally grateful to you for so many reasons, and especially for that, because only thanks to that can I even really process the difference. If I had never been in that trio, I probably wouldn't fully understand the other experience and go like, oh, yeah, wait, hey, it doesn't have to be like this, you know? Like you were speaking in November for the first time. You've been playing for how many years? 12?
Yeah,
you know?
10.
It's like once you taste the freedom and courtesy and respect, everything else looks different.
Wow, this is so nice. Because one, I don't feel like I have to say anything because everybody else is saying all the things that resonate so strongly with me, and I'm often in the situation where I'm being the one asked these questions. And it's so beautiful to hear, you know, how the things that I think and feel resonate so much with you guys. So just because time is of the essence, and I do want to open it up to a few questions. I just, before that, I just want to actually maybe ask Angela one more thing before we change. Can you speak to what we all lose when, well, you spoke earlier about transgender and that not being part of the conversation so much. And I just wanted to know if you could speak to what we all lose when they're rendered invisible, you know, in these conversations, just because it's still, especially in jazz, I think it's still a topic that really rarely ever comes up. So maybe it's not just transgender, but gender non-conforming individuals, because, you know, if I think back when I started terms like fluid, and none of these terms were there. So, and with what Arnetta was saying, I mean, I've definitely was hard, soft, whatever I needed to access at the time, and I didn't know what gender nonconforming meant. I think I was probably naturally doing that just to be successful. And it's also, my personality. But I just, wanted you, if you would.
I think that that we're all really fortunate to be alive and present at this moment when so much is being challenged. And it seems to me that questioning our normal notions of gender, questioning the binary structure of gender, allows us to recognize how much ideology influences everything else. Because in a sense, gender is represented as the most natural aspect of our existence. And when you begin to challenge the binary structure of gender, that means that we can challenge a whole range of other ideologically constructed aspects of the way we think and the way we communicate. And it seems to me that jazz has been such an important part of that process of encouraging those of us who are jazz listeners to think differently about the world. As someone who's been involved in social justice movements and who studied social justice movements, I think that never enough attention is given to the role that music plays, and how music, and especially jazz, helps us to imagine worlds that are beyond our own experience. And so this is why it seems to me that within the jazz world, these issues are being implicitly addressed, but sometimes not always explicitly. Sometimes the ideology still prevail. And the way in which we now have to think about the construction of gender. 10 years ago, if somebody had said, "What are your pronouns?" that would make no sense at all. But now that's become a part of the discourse. And because jazz has been in the forefront of so much social change, it seems to me that jazz players, members of the jazz community, should be especially concerned that we figure out ways to guarantee that jazz is not left behind while the rest of the world moves forward. And so that, the issue of addressing transgender issues, gender, non-conforming, questions of gender non-conformity is absolutely essential. I, as an activist, particularly in the area of prison abolition, I can attest to how that has completely transformed the field of our activism. Not only the fact that it became necessary to recognize and attend to trans prisoners, but to recognize that the whole system of incarceration is a gendering apparatus. So it really changed not only the way in which we look at people who are gender nonconforming, but it changed the way in which we see what abolition means, because it's not only abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, but it's abolition of the binary structure of gender as well. They're completely interconnected. And yeah.
I just have a question for you. I don't just have, I have so much for you. Praise, admiration, and the like, and questions. But from your studies, from your experiences in the front line of activism, where you are working with other forces, individuals, dreamers, etc., to imagine structures that don't exist yet, where can we go within this community to investigate the possibilities that we don't have models of? Are there readings you would suggest? Are there movements we can look to? You know, the music itself is about manifesting the unknown, but I feel a little stifled myself of figuring out how to create something that I can't look to.
Well, you know something, Esperanza, and I just love, you know how much I love your music, so I don't have to tell you that. I'm just telling the audience. Many, many years ago, when I was in jail, I didn't expect that response, but because the point that I want to make is that Nina Simone came to visit me in my jail cell because she was performing at the Marin County Arts Center, and the jail was adjacent to it. Yeah. So. I mean, we had this amazing conversation, and she asked me to give her a reading list because she said that she didn't think she really understood, what the movement was all about, and so I said to her, you have been one of our leaders in this movement. You've understood in a way that many of us who only have access to, words and that kind of discourse, you have made us understand something that's far deeper and far more lasting. And so, yeah, we can talk about reading lists, but I think it's so important that you realize that you're leading us as we explore unknown terrain, what we don't yet know how to speak about in the vocabularies that are available to us. You and Terri and Vijay and all of the amazing jazz musicians help push us in the direction of trying to find words to express that which is not yet expressible in words. And so I always see music in the forefront of social justice struggles. I was saying at a talk I gave not too long ago that I remember going to Grenada in the 1980s, when they were trying to build a socialist society. Maurice Bishop, some of you may know the history of Grenada. And I participated in several rallies. The rallies consisted of about maybe a half an hour of speaking and about 3 hours of music. Because they understood that it was the music that was going to inspire the creation of political communities and communities of struggle. And so, thank you. We'll talk about the reading list later, though.
So, just two quick things. I had maybe 4 panels this week. I was doing quite a bit. And so I asked 3 of my mentors, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, and Jack DeJohnette, who's probably my first really important mentor as an adult when I was 18 years old. He's standing over there. But And I asked them to comment on, you know, what's happening now with women and women in jazz. And so I unfortunately forgot Wayne's quote and Herbie's quote because they're on my phone, which is back there somewhere. But I do have Jack's quote, luckily, since he's standing right here, and I just would like to read what he said. He said, "To me, artistry is artistry, no matter what the gender is. It's time for women to take their rightful place as equals in our predominantly patriarchal society. Now more than ever is the time for my gender to stop being part of the problem and embrace being part of the solution. We could all use more compassion and kindness for each other." And yeah. And I guess I just wanted to, thank, because I had no female role models really, so that's why I try to do my best to be that for other women trying to play. But I did have some great male role models, so thank you. Also, part of this conversation, I wanted to, if they're here, invite maybe Nicole Mitchell and Sarah Serpa to say a few words about We Have Voice. Oh, there you guys are. Yeah, come on. And there's this amazing open letter that We Have Voice has posted. If you're not familiar with this letter, please go online and read it. And if you agree with it, sign it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Terri, for inviting us here. It's really great to witness this conversation. We all resonate a lot with what's been said today, so thank you. I'd like to say that this collective, We Have Voice, kind of grew up a little bit in an organic way. We started having conversations via email or text messages or phone calls due to the rising tide of articles exposing sexual harassment in our community and also in our music industry. So there was this sense that we need to show some solidarity and also to speak up and also just to kind of promote this community where we don't tolerate sexual harassment. And so, do you want to talk a little bit about the letter?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for all these wise words that we've been able to listen to today. It's very inspiring. And basically, this letter is just about us coming together and thinking about some of these things a little bit more deeply. How many musicians are here? Can you raise your hand? So if all of us that are involved in the music, raise your hand if you're in music but not a musician, but you're doing other things in the field. Because so all of us that are involved with this, basically the idea is not only that we think deeply about our role, but also see ourselves individually, that each one of us is a symbol. And so we're modeling for others. So each one of us has some level of power, maybe different depending on who we are and what our positions are in the field. But if we all make choices that are more inclusive, that open the door for more gender balance, open the door for more mentorship and inclusivity, then we'll actually see a change. And so, I mean, signing a letter is part of that in terms of really thinking through the thoughts, but then putting those things into action and thinking about how we operate and how we can create more positive environments where we have the power to do so. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
So you can sign the letter on wehavevoice.org. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So we have a sound check not so long from now, so we don't have a whole lot of time, but would love to take a couple of questions. And please note, if you can make it questions and not comments, that would be appreciated. Sure.
Hi, my name is Marguerite Horberg. I'm the founder of a place called Hot House in Chicago that was founded 30 years ago. And the first event we did was the Women of the New Jazz Festival. So I want to just echo, I'm deeply appreciative of the comments today, and it's just so deep and so Esperanza, your words are just such fuel for much, 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 and Arnetta, continued thoughts and exploration of this kind of veiling and unveiling and changing your posture to accommodate. Unfortunately, my thing is a comment because I work as a presenter, and I think that one of the things I'm advocating to add to the conversation from the business side, especially looking at the nonprofit industrial complex, is the this question of parity and equity economically, and the wage scales that people are sort of stuck with, and questions of gender in this regard of, from my perspective, jazz payments and jazz salaries are very similar to what they were in the 1980s. And, I think that we really, additionally to talking about these issues, have to talk about what the role of nonprofits are in terms of fulfilling what the government has opted out of, and really take a strong stance about the equity of the money that goes to government, to the defense budget, and to the military, and these are gender issues as well. So that's really what I want to say. I just think that from my ongoing observation that it's, the way that male and female dynamics play out between men who are obsessed with discographies and who played with who, and knowing it's such a completely different way of thinking about culture, organizing culture, and feminizing spaces. And I think that all of these things are grist for ongoing conversation. So thank you very much.
So I think about how few women cinematographers there are and how few women directors, and how that shapes the way movies are made and how that shapes the way we think about culture and gender and in our own lives, because that really influences how we see each other. And I think jazz is a very influencing force on the mainstream. Often it experiments on the fringes, and then that bleeds into how, what music we listen to on the radio. And so I'm wondering, how does the predominance of men in the field shape the mainstream, even if people don't listen to jazz?
So this would be a question for anybody who's ever signed a record deal. How many times have you sat in the office and everybody you were talking to was female? So just at that level, we're asking permission from male gatekeepers. Now we can make our own records. All of us can. But marketing, distribution, and presence in the landscape of the quote-unquote jazz world, which I agree often permeates popular music, is still managed by men who are, I think, generally making their decisions not just based on quality of performance, it's also on financial viability, meaning return on their investment, which comes back to this deep comment that our maestra over here mentioned, that we are playing in a commercial playing field, even if we're on the fringe, that still commodifies the female body and female presence on a stage as a performative mode of entertainment. So we as women creators often are still being kept in check in a zone by the male gatekeepers. So that would be one way that men in positions of power in the jazz world are influencing what makes it out into the public arena of fringe music, which then infiltrates more popular modes or popular aesthetics, I guess, of commercial music.
I think we have time for just one more question, one more.
Madison McFerrin, singer-songwriter.
Madison.
Hi, fellow Berkeley alum. So Arnetta and Esperanza, what you guys were saying about the environment at Berkeley really spoke to me, having been there for 4 years. And I was curious because there were so many times at Berkeley where I was the only female in the classroom. And more often than not, I was being taught by a man. And I know that the numbers are something like 75% male attendance or something like that, which at 18 I was very excited by, but got over very quickly. But I was curious because, you know, it seems like it's an environment where it'll be harder to change until it's a 50-50, you know, men, women environment. So until that happens, especially within the female instrumentalists, because even though I am a singer, I was bothered by the fact that any guy would just assume like, oh, you're a vocalist. And it's like, yeah, I'm a vocalist, but like, why couldn't you have assumed I was a guitarist or a bassist or a trumpetist, you know? I'm wondering what institutions like Berkeley are doing to ensure that even in those male-dominated classrooms, what conversations, I like your term gentle ambush, what conversations are being had to ensure that the men are actually a part of the conversation, because I felt being a student there were many times where my point of view was either written off or I had to be in defense mode and therefore couldn't be free as a musician. So to have men in actually participating in the conversation, what are institutions like Berkeley doing to ensure that that happens in the male-dominated classroom until it's a 50-50 environment? Even then, it should still occur, but.
So I think if you're talking about students, the numbers are actually quite a bit higher for female students. It's 40-something% actually, female students at Berkeley. But when you said instrumentalists, those numbers go way down because most of the female students at Berkeley are vocalists. I mean, you know, percentage-wise. So I'm hoping, you know, with a women's initiative at Berkeley to try to get more female students coming to the school, starting this summer actually with a summer program for young female women. Did I say female women? Young female students. But also, Berkeley, because of all this going on, has recently put together a document that is addressing all that's happening at the college now to make these changes. I can't read the document or talk about it because it's not finished. And I was just, you know, made privy to it just, you know, to see if I had some comments or just to see what they're doing. But I think soon, when they finish that document, I think it will make some nice changes at the college, and hopefully other schools will do the same thing and really address that. But I hear you on the female instrumentalists at the school, and it's hard for me as a teacher there because I rarely get female students. And that's very difficult for me. Because also being, you know, in the drum department where I was for so long and the ensemble department, I would be lucky to have 1 or 2 per semester out of maybe 25 or 30 students. But now I'm teaching Global Jazz Institute, and they're trying to, and I'm actually now able to work with singers in the institute, so I do see a little bit more women, but it's just, it's not nearly enough. So hopefully they'll have something that you can read to see what they're doing, and hopefully other schools will too, make some kind of public statement and announcement about what changes they're trying to make. You had one person that you wanted to, a question.
And that opens up the discussion about the gendering of the instruments. And we haven't been able to have that conversation today, even though a lot of the underpinnings of the conversation have pointed to the fact that that's extremely problematic. Yeah, there was the first person who raised her hand is over there in the corner, yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Donna Hope. Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for this panel. Tia, I'm going to shout you out because I'm a proud alum of Spelman College. For those who don't know, it's historically black women's college in Atlanta, Georgia. I love that we're talking about spaces where it's male-dominated, but in Spelman, that's not the case. But our jazz ensemble has lost love at the institutional level. And in fact, Tia Fuller, we were in the jazz ensemble at the same time when we went to Spelman, and we're fighting to save this very precious institution of the jazz ensemble, which is one of the very few all-black women's jazz ensembles that exist. Wow. So what do we do even in our own spaces where we expect that there's support and that it should be obvious, but we are fighting to protect things like an all-black women's jazz ensemble?
I personally don't know the business answer to that, but I think that kind of ties into another subject of the overall discussion of how my generation can help what's going on nowadays in the jazz world. I would say, one, awareness is great. So the fact that you just told us all that situation, everybody in here now knows what's going on. So that's step one, huge step. So now I would say take even more action on it, doing what you and Tia have been doing, because I remember you all talking about it, and it was a very serious conversation. And that's a big deal. Like, Spelman is like minority of a minority. You have female instrumentalists, and they're African American. So that's very crucial. I mean, I wish I had the chance to go to a place like Spelman, even if it was for a master's, but to hear that they're taking away the program, it's kind of not cool. So I would just say just keep spreading the word and acting on it every second you can get. So I'm pretty sure those working in the school can probably talk about how to put something into action a little bit more.
Well, I'd say talk to some writers too. Why don't you come talk to me afterwards, and we'll see what we can make happen for you. Serious.
I thought I'd try to respond to a couple of things that were said. One, well, you were asking Madison, is it, about how to, in the context of an institution that where the atmosphere itself is it's permeated with, you know, male dominance and kind of marginalization of women's perspectives, what can be done. And I think that it really needs to be addressed at every step of the way. It needs to be, it can't be just like, oh, in the last week of this semester, we're going to talk about women in jazz, or something like that, as a sort of like unit on the syllabus or something. Or it can't be like, oh, well, you know, this is Billie Holiday Day. You know, we're going to talk about her as this like isolated individual. Rather, it has to be, at every step of the way, we have to think about this music in the context of community, which means in the context of family, which means in the context of everybody, right? And so it needs to be addressed as like continuous with that. I find that men aren't always, young men, especially college-age men, are not ready for that. And in fact, they'll push back. I had some students this term who pushed back pretty hard and gave me scathing course evaluations. But that's okay. That's okay. I can take it. But what we did at Banff, for example, where the term gentle ambush was used, was that we scheduled a Matt Stevens workshop. He was going to give a workshop, and he, you know, we had the faculty meeting. I pulled him aside. I was like, "Look, I think we're going to hijack your workshop." He said, "Cool, yeah, let me be a part of that instead." You know, because we knew that all the boys would show up for Matt Stevens, but they wouldn't show up like today on a topic of jazz and gender. You know, so that's what we did. Is we got them where they didn't expect it. So sometimes you have to do that. You have to be like, oh, guess what? Actually, what we're doing today is not what you came here for. Sorry. So that's, I mean, I feel like that's sort of what's called for at this point, because it's so baked into the system that we can't just kind of address it through reform. Like, it needs to be something more revolutionary that sort of like starts kind of upending things. Because it's like I said, I mean, it's the, you know, even if people ask, like, what's your favorite jazz record? they're going to say Kind of Blue or Although Supreme or something by Weather Report or something, but it's going to be a bunch of guys, right? Or where'd you read about it? Or like, who are your favorite writers about this music? It's going to be, again, a bunch of guys. Like, it's actually, we've had a century of that, you know? Even though there have been women omnipresent in these forces, Mary Lou Williams, Shirley Horn, you know, Bertha Hope, Alice Coltrane. I mean, the list is endless, but they don't get celebrated. So now it's time to just upend that entire dynamic, and we need to do it in probably these kinds of unpleasant ways sometimes, where you need to kind of ambush folks. And I'm happy to support that any way I can. So just let me know how I can help, that's all.
Well, I think this has been a really enlightening conversation, leading to many more conversations. And I hope that all of you will take these conversations into your communities, into your institutions. I mean, I see people in the audience like Farrah Griffin, who has done a great deal to advance these conversations about jazz and gender. And let me finally, once again, thank my friend, because we've known each other almost 30 years, yeah, for the work that you've done, not only in advancing women in jazz, but making certain that we have the kinds of conversations that are needed in order to be dissatisfied with the advances. Because I think that, you know, on the one hand, we have to be attentive to the victories that we win, because if we say things are the same as they've always been, then it makes no sense to struggle. It makes no sense to get involved. But at the same time, we have to recognize that even though we may have come 5% of the way, we still have 95% to go. So thank you so much for always reminding us of that, and for your absolutely amazing music. And you know, I love the Mosaic Project, and I love Money Jungle, and so thank you, Terri Lyne Carrington.
Thank you. Thank everybody for coming and supporting this conversation and participating in it. And I just want to say one thing. I actually feel that there are quite a few men here. It looks almost, you know, it's very, there's so many men here that I'm so happy about that. I know earlier it seemed like maybe you weren't responding, so the voices sounded a more female, but I see a lot of men here, so thank you for coming. And thank you, Bryce,
not all men,
for initiating this.
I just want to throw a couple numbers real quick at you that should hopefully give us a little hope, some positive change will be coming. Last year at Jazzfest, we had 17% women band leaders. This year, we have 36%. I know we can change. I know we can do better. However, if you look at the number of musicians performing, we had over 600 musicians, and only a quarter of them were women. So it's beyond what I can do as a presenter. It's the band leaders can also do their part. I was recently approached by Vanessa Reed at PRS in the UK. They have a program called Key Change, which is asking presenters to make a commitment of 50-50% gender equality of band leaders. And they have a meeting in February that I'm going to go attend. So just to show our commitment and commitment of other presenters that are going to be signing up to Key Change. I just want to throw a couple numbers real quick at you that should hopefully give us a little hope, some positive change will be coming. Last year at Jazzfest, we had 17% women band leaders. This year, we have 36%. Wow. I know we can change. I know we can do better. However, if you look at the number of musicians performing, we had over 600 musicians, and only a quarter of them were women. So it's beyond what I can do as a presenter. It's the band leaders can also do their part. I was recently approached by Vanessa Reed at PRS in the UK